Dwight Eisenhower Ike was a protege of General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915 in the top third of his class. This class included two other Second World War Army commanders, Omar Bradley, who would command the U.S. forces in Normandy, and Mark W. Clark, who in 1944 was commanding the U.S. Fifth Army in Italy. By the time the United States entered the Great War in April 1917, Eisenhower was serving with the 57th Infantry Regiment in Texas, and, to his considerable chagrin, he was kept in the USA to train recruits. After the war, he entered the newly formed Tank Corps, where he met an officer recently returned from France, a flamboyant and wealthy cavalry officer, George Patton. Patton introduced Eisenhower to General Fox Connor, then the U.S. commander in Panama, who took Ike onto his staff. This move set the pattern for Eisenhower's career in the interwar years. He became a staff officer with wide experience in staff duties in Panama with Fox Connor, then more staff work under MacArthur in the Philippines and later in Washington. Eisenhower was therefore a widely experienced and well-respected staff officer when the USA finally entered the Second World War in December 1941. His first chance for field command came in 1942, when he was appointed Allied Commander-in-Chief for Operation Torch, the North African landings. North Africa was Ike's first taste of action and the place where he first met the British field commanders, notably Alexander and Montgomery, and made many friends. Eisenhower had been chosen for this task by the head of the U.S. Army and chairman of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, the body directing the Allied war effort, General George Marshall. Marshall sent Ike to London in the summer of 1942 as commanding general for the European Theatre of Operations, the ETO, although Eisenhower's substantive rank was only colonel. After Torch, though still a substantive colonel, he was promoted to four-star general and appointed Allied commander in the Mediterranean Theatre. Finally, in January 1944, he was appointed Allied Supreme Commander for the Normandy invasion. Although entirely without battlefield command experience, Eisenhower had three assets that made him the ideal choice for the post of Allied Supreme Commander. First of all, he had a vast amount of experience in staff work at the highest level. Secondly, he was entirely without national prejudices of any kind, a quality that was not readily found in some of his subordinate commanders, American or British. Finally, he was American, and his ready charm contained a steel core. However, even if some other Allied commander had all the required qualities, the overall commander at SHAEF was destined to come from the USA military demographics. The fact that the Americans were playing the larger part in the Western European War would see to that. These comments should not be seen as dismissive, for Eisenhower had other assets. He was in every sense a big man, an ideal generalissimo, someone who never lost sight of the big picture and could get people to work together. Such men are rare, and in 1944 Dwight D. Eisenhower was the right man in the right place. The command set up at the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force or SHAEF. The basic setup is shown on this plan: an American Chief and Chief of Staff, but with a British Deputy Allied Supreme Commander and British commanders for the three elements, land, sea and air of the invasion forces. This seems a fair division of responsibility, but the simplicity of the structure conceals a number of inherent problems, and since a significant part of this book will be taken up with arguments between the commanders, the tensions within this structure have to be understood now. First of all, there was a disagreement between SHAEF and the American Army Air Force commander in Europe, General Karl Spaatz, about the need for a further layer of command at SHAEF in the shape of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, AEAF. This was probably a valid argument, but it was undoubtedly exacerbated by the dislike felt by many Americans for the AEAF's British commander, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. It has to be added that Spaatz's resistance to the AEAF was mainly over the AEAF claim to control of the strategic heavy bomber forces, the US 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command, not over control of the two tactical air forces, the US 9th and the British 2nd Tactical Air Force, 2nd TAF. These tactical air forces were equipped with medium bombers and ground attack fighters, and were tasked to support the armies in the field. The role of the tactical air forces in the Battle of Normandy cannot be underestimated. In spite of a tendency to bomb and strafe their own troops on occasion, Allied victory in the Battle of Normandy owes much to the skill and dedication of the tactical air force crews. The Air Force was also represented by the Deputy Allied Supreme Commander, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, who, as we shall see, was very anxious to secure the Air Forces a large share of the credit for the forthcoming Allied victory, a credit which was fully deserved and which no one denied. Tedder had no real grasp of ground operations and no particular time for General Montgomery. There was no argument over the naval member, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. Even though the naval member on the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee and one of the combined Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Ernest King, was a fervent Anglophobe, Ramsay was a competent and popular commander with wide experience of amphibious operations. Besides, at sea the Anglo-US boot was on the other foot. The bulk of the shipping and naval forces on D-Day, and for the subsequent supply of logistical support and reinforcements to the troops ashore, would fly the white or red ensigns of the Royal Navy or the British Merchant Navy. In every way, Admiral Ramsay was clearly the right man for the job. The air and naval elements were not, however, the main area for potential trouble in Normandy. The area of contention involved the land forces commander for the invasion phase of Overlord, General Montgomery, former commander of the 8th Army in North Africa, victor of El Alamein, conqueror of Rommel, the most charismatic British soldier of the Second World War, and a man many people detested. General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery was not an easy man to know and a very hard man to like. Monty's biggest problem was vanity, says Major General Shan Hackett, who served under Montgomery in the Western Desert and at Arnhem. He had his own way of doing things, thought he always knew best, and was not open to criticism. On the other hand, with Monty, at least you knew what was going on, which is not always the case in military matters. Monty was a hero to the British soldier and the British public who saw him as the architect of victory. To the common soldier, the tank crew and the infantryman, Monty was a general who cared about them. Dennis Keane, a private in the signals platoon of the 1st Battalion, the Worcester Regiment, 43rd Division, puts it like this: Monty was there. When he was in command, you knew you had a commander, that someone was in charge. When we were stuck in the Reichwald in 1945, water everywhere, suddenly there was Monty, driving down the line in his jeep, tossing out packets of fags to the lads. When you were in trouble, Monty was around, not at the rear, and it trickled down to the other officers. Another time, just after crossing the Seine in Normandy, we were held up by a couple of tigers, and they were tigers, not Mark IVs or anything. We had pictures later. We had no armour up, just our 6-pounder anti-tank guns, but up comes our brigade commander and then our divisional commander to sort things out, and that was because they took their tone from Monty. I am sure he was difficult, but we thought he knew what he was doing, and he did all right by us. It is curious, and in some ways quite moving, to realise how in an age without television or widespread public relations, this small, neat, brusque general managed to make his presence felt throughout his armies, from divisional commanders to private soldiers. The relationship between a commander and his soldiers is always complex, but it seems to come down to a matter of trust. The men trusted Monty with their lives because they knew him to be competent. Soldiers much prefer a competent martinet to an easy-going officer who does not know his job. An officer who knows his job will be popular. Montgomery was no martinet, and the trust between him and his soldiers cut both ways. "It is the men who matter, not the machines," he said in 1945, on leaving command of the 21st Army Group. If you tell the British soldier what you want and launch him properly into battle, he will never let you down. Never. When Monty was around, men felt that matters were under control, that their lives would not be squandered, that their needs were understood. That is not always the case in military affairs where chaos and shambles seem to rule, and Montgomery should be given considerable credit for his inestimable contribution to leadership and morale. Nor was this indispensable contribution confined to the British Army. In the months before D-Day, Monty visited all the US divisions under his command, and US accounts record how well his visits went down with the US soldiers. Here was an officer who had seen war at the sharp end and knew what he was doing. However, most of the US generals did not like Monty. This feeling had its roots in the Anglophobia felt by many senior American officers, a feeling rooted in US history, where Britain, not Germany, is the ancestral enemy, the national opponent in the Revolution and the War of 1812. Mutual acquaintance did not always remedy this emotion. Americans mistook British reserve for snobbery. The British mistook American enthusiasm for brashness. Both nationals thought the others rude, but in Monty's case the issue often got personal. Quite apart from the facts mentioned above Monty's vanity and his brusqueness, which many Americans certainly took for rudeness, many of them, especially George Patton, were jealous of Monty's greater experience and reputation, two assets that Montgomery did not labour to conceal. This comment has to be qualified by the fact that the better the US generals knew Monty, the better they understood him. They may not have liked him any better, but they understood him, respected his abilities, and could work with him. Omar Bradley states that in Normandy he could not have wished for a better or more understanding commander. General Simpson, commander of the US Ninth Army, which served under Montgomery in the later stages of the campaign in northwest Europe, always got on well with Montgomery, and the US liaison officers who served at Monty's headquarters had no difficulty coping with his ways. That apart, it is fair to say that among the US generals in Normandy, Patton detested Montgomery. Bradley endured him, though their relations deteriorated after the Ardennes debacle at the end of 1944, and Eisenhower, knowing him better, tolerated and respected him. Patton's detestation was augmented by envy of Montgomery's reputation as a battlefield commander, and by the unadmitted fact that Patton and Montgomery were not dissimilar. George Patton had more than his fair share of bombast and vanity, and Eisenhower would ruefully refer to Monty and Patton as my two prima donnas. Bernard Montgomery was a frontline soldier with plenty of varied experience in war. Commissioned into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in 1908, he served on the northwest frontier of India against the Pathan tribesmen and went to France with his battalion in August 1914. In November, he was severely wounded at the First Battle of Ypres when leading an attack on the village of Météran, an action for which he was promoted to captain and awarded the DSO, a rare distinction for a young platoon commander. On recovering from his wounds, he was appointed to the staff and spent the rest of the war successively as brigade major, then GSO-2, first at a division and then at a corps HQ. He ended the war as GSO-1, chief of staff of an infantry division. The First World War taught Montgomery two lessons he never forgot. Firstly, that the battlefield is a confusing place, and the task of a commander is to impose order on it, dictating the course of events by careful planning and meticulous staff work. Secondly, that the lives of his soldiers were precious, and must not be thrown away on ill-conceived attacks which offered no possibility of gain. Those other generals and historians who sneer at Montgomery for being cautious or timid during the Normandy campaign should bear these 2 points in mind. He had been there, up at the sharp end. With a few rare exceptions, they had not. Between the wars, Montgomery served as instructor at the staff colleges at Camberley and Quetta in India, interspersing these staff appointments with spells commanding his regiment in Palestine. Monty never lost touch with the ordinary soldiers. During this time he suffered a personal blow from which he may never have recovered, the death of his much-loved wife, a lady who had humanized Montgomery and provided him with both affection and a range of interests outside the narrow world of his military profession. After her death, the Monty of legend, incisive, critical, abrasive, self-regarding, more and more intolerant of failure, increasingly appears. Had she lived, it is at least arguable that Monty would not have developed those domineering characteristics that so infuriated his peers and superiors. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, Montgomery was a major general commanding a division in Palestine. Back in the UK, he was given command of the 3rd Infantry Division in the Dunkirk campaign. After the evacuation, he was given command of the 2nd Corps in the south of England, where his skill in training and motivating troops was noted by the CIGS Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke. However, Montgomery's great chance came in 1942, when he was sent to command 8th Army in North Africa, arriving at the moment when this force had been driven back to Alamein by Rommel's Africa Corps, and disaster was looming. Whatever his exploits in northwest Europe in 1944–45, the name of Montgomery will always be closely connected, at least in Britain, with the exploits of the Desert Army. Under his command, 8th Army drove the Axis powers back across North Africa to their final defeat at Tunis, and then, in conjunction with American forces under Patton and Bradley, overran the island of Sicily and invaded Italy. In January 1944, Monty returned to England to take up the post of Ground Forces Commander under Eisenhower for the invasion, and stepped immediately into a nest of controversy, much of it of his own making. Even so, whatever his personal flaws, Montgomery was by far the most experienced battlefield commander on the Allied side. Compared with Montgomery, the American commanders had very little battlefield experience. While it might have been more tactful not to point this out at the time, this is not a point any historian should ignore. Monty knew the score on the Allied command structure and was happy to serve under the American Supreme Commander Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force on Christmas Day, 1943. Eisenhower was then shown the Cossack Plan and did not like it at all. Eisenhower had the experience to know a good plan when he saw one, and in his eyes the Cossack Plan would not do. He showed it to Montgomery, who did not like it either, and while Ike went to confer with the Allied leaders in Morocco and then with Marshall in Washington, he sent Montgomery to London to take a closer look at the plan and suggest modifications. The basic Eisenhower-Montgomery objection was not the place chosen for the landings, the coast of Normandy and the Bay of the Seine, but the width and weight of the assault. They wanted to attack on a wider front and with more troops, tanks and guns, and they were right. The limitations of the Cossack Plan were not the fault of General Morgan and his staff, a fact that Montgomery would have been wise to acknowledge and commiserate about, rather than dismiss General Morgan's plan as fundamentally flawed. As it was, with his usual lack of tact, Montgomery was scathing about the plan's shortcomings, and his open disparagement of Cossack made a lifetime enemy of General Sir Frederick Morgan, who was to remain at Sheaffe in 1944 as British Deputy Chief of Staff to Eisenhower, an ideal position from which to poison the atmosphere when Montgomery's name came up. Morgan was also a close confidant of Sir Arthur Tedder, a man who had similar aims. What Cossack needed and could not get from the combined chiefs, specifically the American admiral, Ernest King was more landing craft. The prime reason for the short invasion frontage suggested by Cossack was a shortage of shipping, notably landing craft and especially the vital LSTs, landing ship tanks, which alone could carry the armoured divisions into the beach, and that was not Morgan's fault. The blame should have been laid at the door of Admiral Ernest King, who controlled the allocation of ships to theatres, and much preferred to send LSTs to the Pacific than to the British-dominated ETO. There was also the problem, one which lies outside the scope of this book, of the US commitment to a landing in the south of France Operation Anvil, later Operation Dragoon, to which the Americans were totally committed and the British totally opposed. Eisenhower and Montgomery brooded over this problem for a while, and finally decided, not least because it was vital to take the port of Cherbourg, that the front of the invasion must be broadened to include a landing on the Cotentin coast, subsequently Utah. It must also include another airborne division landing in the central Cotentin, which would aid the Utah forces in moving north to take Cherbourg. If this meant putting back the date of the invasion and the Anvil Dragoon operation, so be it. Once the armies were ashore, their most vital need would be for a constant supply of reinforcements, ammunition and fuel. When it was all added up, it meant that the invasion date must be put back from May to June 1944, something General Morgan and his staff had worked out months ago. Cherbourg was the most obvious choice as the major port, But it was inevitable that after this port was finally in Allied hands, it would have to be cleared of mines and booby traps and virtually rebuilt before it could be restored to working order. Until that could happen, the invasion forces would be supplied through two prefabricated ports, the famous Mulberry harbours. One of these would be set up at Arromanches to supply the British and Canadian forces, the other off Omaha to supply the American armies. These, therefore, were the basic parameters for the invasion phase. Get ashore, stay ashore, link up the beaches into one continuous bridgehead, take a port, build up the force ashore in the bridgehead, in the meantime using the Mulberries, then break out and move inland and on to victory. That was the primary task of Operation Overlord, and the job of deciding how to carry it out was handed over to General Montgomery and his Allied command, the 21st Army Group. Montgomery was generally regarded as the master of the planned set-piece battle. American historians frequently make this point before moving on to state or imply that he was therefore totally useless at any other kind of battle. His plan for the Normandy battle would require the assistance of his American colleagues, and its implementation would require the approval of his superior officer, General Eisenhower, and the combined chiefs of staff. But no one, at this time or at any level, disputed that Bernard Montgomery was the best man for this particular job, getting the armies ashore and winning the initial battle for Normandy. This would certainly start with a set-piece battle, to a plan laid before the first troops went ashore. After that, who knew what would happen? When Montgomery was handed this task in January 1944, the date for the landing was already fixed for May 1st. He had less than 5 months to plan and carry out the biggest amphibious operation in recorded history, and the extent of his task should not be underestimated. Neither should the problem of supply. In most popular military histories, there is a natural tendency to concentrate on the battles and the exploits of the fighting troops. This, while understandable, has the effect of taking attention away from the underlying fact that without adequate and sustained logistical support, armies can neither fight nor function for long. Before closing this chapter, it is therefore necessary to raise the argument beyond the muck and bullets level and take a close look at the question of logistics, that arcane branch of the military art concerned with the problems of supply. This will be covered in some detail later, but the importance of supply during the Normandy campaign has to be grasped now. Consider the day-to-day requirements of 3 armies in the field. The troops will need everything from fuel, food and ammunition to cigarettes and toilet paper, and the rapid establishment of working ports was the most vital task for the Allied armies once they were ashore and firmly established. The troops that splashed ashore on D-Day carried their weapons, a quantity of ammunition and a couple of 24-hour ration packs. That was not going to last them very long. Until proper ports could be set up, they relied for supply on what could be landed over open beaches and at the Mulberry harbours, but these were of limited capacity and exposed, as we shall see, to the full force of the elements. It needs to be borne in mind that one purpose of pulling the German forces onto the Second Army front and shielding the US First Army from heavy counterattacks from the east was to allow the US forces to advance north to Cherbourg and west into Brittany as quickly as possible, where their prime purpose was not to gain ground but to seize ports. As for threatening or taking Caen, this city was more important to the Germans than it was to the Allies. For Montgomery, the importance of Caen was its importance to the Germans. Without doubt, they would strain all their resources to retain it and prevent an Allied breakout to the south and east, which would cut off those German forces deeper in western Normandy. With luck and good judgment on the Allied side, this strain would eventually stretch the German resources until they broke. In Montgomery's calculations, if not those he started with, certainly those he quickly arrived at, the Germans would be most anxious to hang on to Caen. Therefore, to defend it, they would be obliged to commit whatever forces they had. There was still an element of calculation here, for it was equally important that the Germans did not commit those of the 15th Army, mainly located north of the Seine on D-Day, and kept there by Operation Fortitude. If 15th Army intervened in Normandy before the Allied build-up was complete, and perhaps even after that matters might go beyond Allied control. There was an inherent, if unavoidable, snag with this strategy, as we shall see later. The US armies had to seize ports and ground in the west, while the direction the Allied armies must eventually head lay north and east. But after the breakout, the further the Allies advanced to the north and east, the longer their supply lines would become. For the moment there was no help for this. In the days and weeks after D-Day, the troops ashore needed supply simply to hold the ground they already held. This was Phase 2, where our story really begins. The build-up after D-Day, when the Allied bridgehead and the troops within it began to come under steady and mounting pressure from the troops of the German forces defending Normandy and their doughty commander, Erwin Rommel. The Germans, June 7th. We must defeat the enemy on the beaches, and on the first day of the landing that will be the longest day. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Commander, Army Group B, Normandy, 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, once head of the doughty Afrika Korps and now commander of Army Group B in Normandy, was a great general but not a lucky one. When the two great crises broke over his command, Montgomery's attack at El Alamein in October 1942 and the D-Day landings of June 1944, Rommel was absent from his headquarters and unable to exert any immediate influence on the battle. On June 5th, having been told by his meteorologists that the Channel gales made a landing impossible, he returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. Had he been at his HQ and fully in charge of events, matters might have been handled very differently in those first few vital hours, always assuming he had been allowed a free hand by the German Führer, Adolf Hitler. The German command structure in France was as shown. The German command structure in France was as follows. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Adolf Hitler, Oberkommando West, OB West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander, Panzergroup West General Geyer von Schweppenberg, Commander, Army Group B, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, 15th Army north of the Seine, 7th Army south of the Seine. One point about this structure should be noticed, the looming presence of the German Chancellor and Führer, Adolf Hitler. Hitler took a close and detailed interest in the battle for Normandy, kept 4 crack divisions, 1 SS Panzer, 12 SS Panzer, and 17 SS Panzer Grenadiers and Panzer Lehr in OKW reserve, from which they could not be moved without his personal order, and he felt free to interfere with the commander's decisions down to the lowest level. 2 of these divisions, 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, were moved to Normandy in April 1944, but they remained in OKW reserve. The next point to note is that Panzer Group West, which contained most of the remaining panzer divisions in the West 9 and 11 Panzer, 2nd, 116 and 21st Panzer, though under the command of Geyer von Schweppenberg, who was in turn responsible to von Rundstedt, could also only be deployed on Hitler's orders. It is fair to add that von Schweppenberg also had a very direct say in how and where the divisions of Panzer Group West were to be deployed thereafter, and his views varied more than somewhat from those of the Army Group B commander, Erwin Rommel. Field Marshal Rommel had been posted to France in December 1943. His first task, as charged by the Führer, was a total inspection of the Atlantic Wall defences, the western bastion of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. Rommel toured the Atlantic Wall from Norway to the Spanish frontier and was horrified by what he found. In all but a few places, most notably the Pas-de-Calais and the Normandy coast, the wall did not really exist beyond a few strands of barbed wire, the occasional machine gun post, a few artillery pieces, and a scattering of mines. If it was to offer any kind of obstacle to the Allied invasion, the Atlantic Wall would need to be rapidly developed and supplied with a quantity of troops, guns and tanks, but there was, inevitably, a snag. The wall was simply too long for Germany's current resources. To create adequate defences along 1,000 miles of coast was impossible, but fortunately unnecessary. For a defender to foresee what an attacker will do, it is only necessary to calculate what the defender would do in his place. In the case of Overlord, German calculations revealed that the likely places for an Allied invasion between Norway and the Spanish frontier could be reduced to just 2, the Pas-de-Calais and the Calvados coast of Normandy. The calculations were complicated, but the deciding factor was air power. In the Pas-de-Calais, 20 miles from Dover, Allied fighters could easily dominate the landing area and beat off any attempts by the Luftwaffe to interfere with the invasion. The Normandy beaches were further away, some 80 miles from the south coast of England, but the Allied air forces could still dominate Normandy from English bases, even with fighters, and in 1944 Allied fighter range was steadily increasing. The Brittany coast, further west, had more ports and fewer defences, but was beyond the range of fighter cover and exposed to Atlantic gales, while north of the Pas-de-Calais, the landing beaches south of the Belgian frontier led towards the 1914-18 Western Front of fatal memory. For attacker and defender, therefore, the choice clearly lay between Normandy and the Pas-de-Calais. These were the areas the Germans opted to defend and which the Allied commanders prepared to threaten. Normandy with the actual invasion, Operation Overlord, the Pas-de-Calais with a spoof invasion. Operation Fortitude and deciding which was which would be one of the prime concerns of the German commanders. Having delivered his report, Rommel applied for a field command in the west and was appointed to the command of Army Group B under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a post which would make Rommel directly responsible for repelling the invasion wherever the Allies came ashore. Gerd von Rundstedt was 69 in 1944. He was born near Halle in 1875, the scion of a military family, and entered the officer corps in 1892 at the age of 17. By 1914 he had reached the rank of captain in the Imperial Army, having already passed the staff course and served in several staff appointments. In August 1914 he was promoted major, but failed to make any further advances in rank for the rest of the war. Staying on into the peace, he was promoted general in 1927, and in October 1932 was promoted to full general and command of the 1st Army Group. A year later, in 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. There is no evidence that von Rundstedt was a great supporter of the Führer, but he played a full part in the re-equipping of the Wehrmacht and its training in the tactics of blitzkrieg. In the process, von Rundstedt was promoted yet again to Colonel General, but in November 1938, now aged 63, he left active duty and was placed on the retired list. Von Rundstedt was not on the retired list for long. He returned to active duty in June 1939 and was given command of Army Group South, which he commanded in the invasion of Poland, during which his troops took the city of Warsaw. A month later, in October 1939, von Rundstedt was appointed to Army Group A in the west, and led that group in the invasion of France and the Low Countries in the summer of 1940, being rewarded for his success with promotion to the rank of Field Marshal, a promotion he shared that day with 11 other German generals. Then von Rundstedt's star began to dim somewhat. His next appointment took him back to Army Group South for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia in June 1941, where his group was tasked with overrunning the Caucasus. When the Führer refused to allow a tactical withdrawal at one stage in the campaign, von Rundstedt resigned and was again placed on the retired list, but as before, his retirement did not last long. In March 1942, he was recalled to active duty and given the temporary post of Commander-in-Chief West. This appointment was confirmed in May 1942, and von Rundstedt was still holding it when Rommel arrived in France in the winter of 1943. By that time, von Rundstedt had largely lost interest in the war. His time in France and the Low Countries over the last 2 years had not been a happy one. Tasked to build up the Western defences by Hitler's directive number 40 of March 23, 1942, he was kept short of troops, especially of well-equipped and fully trained frontline formations, of armour, artillery and all the wherewithal, in mines, wire and concrete to construct adequate beach defences. There was also constant pressure from OKW. From the day of his appointment, von Rundstedt was badgered by Hitler, by Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the Führer's Chief of Staff, and by Colonel General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of OKW, a man known in the Wehrmacht as Hitler's lackey, to do better, move faster, and ensure the security of the West so that the Führer's staff could concentrate on the steadily worsening situation in the east. Von Rundstedt could not obtain the resources necessary to create a real barrier along the western coast, and privately considered Hitler a madman and the war as good as lost. However, if young Rommel wanted to expend his energies in attempting to coax the necessities out of Hitler and fortify the wall for the coming invasion, Gerd von Rundstedt was not going to stand in his way. Rommel's work in strengthening the Atlantic Wall falls outside the borders of this book, enough to say that he did all that any commander could have done in the circumstances, but it was not enough to keep the invaders out. Rommel never believed that the wall alone, however strong and well defended, could achieve that purpose on its own. The successful defeat of the forthcoming invasion depended on selecting the right strategy, and there the choice lay between defeating the invading forces on the 7th Beaches or a heavy commitment of reserves to drive them into the sea in the days after the landing, once it had been established that this was the real landing and not a feint. In the spring of 1944, the German field commanders in Normandy, essentially Rommel and von Schweppenberg, held two basic but conflicting points of view on how to defeat the invasion. Rommel believed that since the Allies had control of the air, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to bring up adequate reserves and drive the Allies out once they were firmly established ashore. Rommel therefore believed that the Allies must be defeated on the beaches and ordered his troops to prepare for battle on the day of the landings, the longest day, as he called it. His men were to dig in along the shore and be supplied with all the support he could muster: mines, wire, artillery, machine guns and tanks, and fight the enemy on the tide line. In Rommel's view, the first day would be vital. According to Major Hans von Luck of 21st Panzer, Rommel told me that if the Allies will land and we cannot throw them back into the sea in 24 hours, it is the beginning of the end. Other opinions held that with 1,200 miles of coast to defend and inadequate resources available, an Allied landing could not be prevented, even in the two most likely areas, which in themselves covered many miles of coast. This being so, it would be as well to let the Allies land, establish exactly where they were, and only then hurl all the available reserves, especially a quantity of armour, against the bridgehead and drive the invaders into the sea. The main proponent of this view was Georg von Schweppenberg, but he was supported by von Rundstedt. Von Rundstedt's strategy also depended on hanging on to the major ports' fortress positions, in the German plan, thereby denying the Allies the opportunity to swiftly build up their forces, while German reserves were mustered in quantity to smite the Allies hard. This aspect of the plan had its less beneficial side, for the defence of these fortress ports tied up many troops in garrison and employed a quantity of artillery in static defence. All these views have merit depending on the circumstances, but in the circumstances of June 1944, Rommel's decision to fight on the beaches was probably right. However, as we shall see in future chapters, Rommel's decision to do so had unforeseen consequences that were not entirely for the good of his troops, not least that they were thereby exposed to the devastating effects of naval gunfire and tied into static defence to retain ground, which the Führer refused to let them abandon. Rommel and his troops laboured on their defences throughout the spring and early summer of 1944, and in the end they were able to create, in certain parts of the coast, a wall that was extremely tough but very thin. This again provided an inherent problem, because the essence of any defence is depth. Had time and resources permitted, Rommel intended to create a defensive system in Normandy some 6 miles deep, crammed with troops and strongpoints and carpeted by 200 million mines. Fortunately for the Allies, time did not permit the completion of such a system. Beyond the beaches there were few defences apart from those provided by the local terrain, although, as we shall see, this terrain, the Normandy bocage, was to prove more than adequate when manned by resolute, well-trained and well-equipped soldiers and sown with vast numbers of mines. Apart from adequate defences, Rommel was short of men and equipment, especially artillery and armour. Army Group B contained 2 armies, the 7th Army, stationed south of the Seine, and the 15th Army, largely stationed north of that river, though some 15th Army units were deployed west of Honfleur on the Seine estuary. We are mainly concerned here with the troops committed south of the river, before or during the battle. Once the Seine was crossed, the Battle of Normandy was officially over. The British official history records that between June 6th and August 31st during the Battle of Normandy, the Allies were confronted by a total of 4 German armies: the 7th, 15th, 5th Panzer Army, formerly Panzer Group West, and finally by elements of the 1st Army, in all consisting of 13 corps, mustering a total of 51 divisions. Not all of these were committed at one time, and the main force confronting the Allies for much of the Battle of Normandy was the 7th Army, commanded at the start of the battle by General Friedrich Dollmann. Dollmann's command on the eve of the invasion can best be described from the west. From the Cotentin Peninsula to the west bank of the River Orne, Normandy was defended by troops of the 84th Infantry Corps. Again, from the west, this consisted of the 243rd Division in the Cotentin, the 709th Division in Cherbourg, and along the east coast as far as the Vire estuary, followed by the 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions, which defended the coast from the western side of the Vire estuary to the eastern side of the River Orne. Apart from the 352nd, all these divisions were static formations, largely dependent on horse transport. Horses were in general use in the German army throughout the Second World War, only the SS divisions and some select armoured formations being fully mechanised. There were a number of other formations, including the crack 6th Parachute Regiment and the well-trained 91st Air Landing Division, both based at the foot of the Cotentin. One chronic problem facing the commanders in Normandy was the steady seepage of their best units to the Eastern Front. These tended to be the armoured divisions, especially SS Panzer divisions and other first-class formations, which were only replaced, if at all, by troops of lesser quality, inadequately trained and without the latest equipment. This gloomy situation began to change somewhat in the winter of 1943–44, and by D-Day the number of divisions in the West had been increased, in number, equipment and performance, an increase duly reported to the Allied commanders by Ultra, the intelligence information obtained by British cryptographers at Bletchley Park, who had cracked the secret of the German Enigma machines in 1940. Ultra decrypts confirmed that by the end of May 1944 there were only 18 German divisions in Normandy and Brittany. Only 2 of these divisions, the 91st Air Landing and 352nd Infantry, were fully equipped and properly trained field divisions, and the only infantry reserve close to the beaches was the 6th Parachute Regiment, which was held around the town of Carentan. Normandy had been a backwater of the war since 1940, so in spite of Hitler's decision to reinforce the West in 1944, many of the regiments and battalions in these formations were second rank, filled with older men or those with chronic health and fitness problems, stomach battalions in the jargon of the time, or had been topped up with unreliable volunteers from Soviet Russia and the Balkans. In some German battalions, various forms of paybook were needed to cope with the Cossacks, Romanians, Georgians, Serbs and Tatars these units now contained. The other obvious German failure at the start of the battle was a shortage of armour. The only panzer unit close to the coast on D-Day was 21st Panzer, which had been deployed south of Caen, astride the road to Falaise. There were 2 more panzer divisions close by, 12 SS Panzer around Evreux, and Panzer Lehr on the plain of the Beauce, close to the city of Chartres. As noted, both divisions had been in OKW reserve, but both of these were offered to OB West von Rundstedt on D-Day, and were on the move towards the beaches before dawn on D+1. Colonel Helmut Rittgen of Panzer Lehr comments, "There was to have been a major attack by 1st SS Panzer Corps within 48 hours of the landing, a violent attack by 3 panzer divisions, but for various reasons, notably Allied air power, this did not happen. Only 21 panzer got forward, and they had to come back. The beach defences were therefore not reinforced, and these were not strongly held. For example, on the British and Canadian beaches, the 716th Division was a static division, almost without transport other than horse-drawn, and made up of elderly soldiers with little or no combat experience. Nor were these German divisions all up to strength. Some armoured divisions, which should have had 200 tanks, had less than 100 tanks of various types, and the formidable Tigers with their 88mm guns were fortunately for the British tank crews very unreliable and required much maintenance. German infantry divisions were now being reduced in establishment from around 14,000 men to about 8,000 men, far fewer than the ration strength in a British or American division. The SS Panzer divisions, on the other hand, were being brought up to a field strength of 22,000 men and equipped where possible with Mark V Panthers or the Mark VI Tiger, although the bulk of their armour was still the Mark IV. For example, on May 19th, Ultra reported the presence close to Normandy of the 1st SS Panzer, Adolf Hitler, up to strength with over 20,000 men. This decrypt gave no equipment details for 1 SS, but the same decrypt supplied the equipment scale for 2 SS Panzer Das Reich, then based at Toulouse. This unit had 55 Mark IVs and 37 Mark V Panthers on strength, with 46 Mark IVs and 62 Panthers still to be delivered. A month earlier, 2 SS Panzer had a ration strength of 17,000 men, and at about the same time Ultra reported that the strength of 12 SS Panzer amounted to 22,390 men. An SS Panzer division therefore had almost 3 times the manpower of a Wehrmacht infantry division and much greater firepower. Although all these units were to be written down in the fighting, the evidence suggests that the SS Panzer units and Panzer units in general were always going to be stronger in manpower and better equipped than any Wehrmacht infantry division. These Panzer units also contained strong infantry elements, Panzer grenadiers, motorized infantry. That element apart, the German advantage lay in their equipment, which was, in almost every respect, superior to that of the Allied armies, and to the fact that they were good soldiers, fighting on the defensive. The problem for Rommel and his commanders was that they did not have enough of them, and reinforcements and replacements would be hard to come by. Les Varga, then a rifleman in Company C, 1st Battalion, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, gives a personal view of these German soldiers. The German soldiers came in all types. If we were up against the Waffen-SS, Hitler-Jugend or paratroops, we knew we were up against a soldier who might be our superior, man to man. If they were 12 SS, Hitler-Jugend, we hated them with a ferocity that still prevails. Why? Because we found several of our brigade lined up against a wall and shot by the 12th SS Panzer Division, and we had an absolute order about them by D+12, no prisoners. This order was verbal, not written. We took SS officers, but only for interrogation purposes. Such Hitler-Jugend thugs as I observed or tried to speak to displayed no civilizing virtues whatsoever, even in the face of certain execution. The ordinary German soldier, who might well not be a German, quite often fought only as long as he had an officer or a non-com to answer to. We had no animus for these. They were the same as us, caught in the awful inevitability of a war neither of us wanted or made. Reg Rolf of 41, Royal Marine. Commando also comments on the German infantry soldier. Their mortaring was very good and constant, and they had the 6-barreled Nebelwerfer or Moaning Mini, which was really bad. My mate Blondie Thwaites was killed by a mortar fragment at Salanel. The German snipers were good, and they were very adept at booby traps and had strong fighting patrols. When we sent out a patrol, it usually consisted of a big section, say 16 men. The German patrols always had about 50 men and lots of automatic weapons. To sum up on the Normandy battle, I think it was a pretty close-run thing. Ted Morris, a medical orderly with 225 parachute field ambulance, was captured by the Germans when attending to some wounded. I was searched, and they made me and the escort carry the stretcher, and we set off towards their lines. At a crossroad, I told the escort to put the stretcher down while I dressed Eddie Walker's stomach wound, having indicated to the Germans what I was going to do. This task was interrupted by a big Jerry officer waving a machine pistol who kicked me to my feet and made us march on guarded by a small Jerry also armed with a machine pistol. Later on, I was interrogated, name, rank and number was all they got, and the German said, "You are 6th Airborne," and let me go, and I was taken to a cookhouse where a German soldier said we were soldiers like them, and we were fed. After a day or so, I was put in charge of some wounded prisoners, and we left for the rear through Ep.2. On the whole, the front-line troops treated us all right. Brian Guy, a sapper with 246 Field Company, RE in the 3rd British Infantry Division, has his memories of this time. My abiding memory of Normandy is the noise and the smell. The noise of mortars, shells, tank engines, and in the little fields, the bocage with high hedges and narrow lanes, the mines and the machine guns. Then there was the smell. Wherever you went, the smell of death, human and animal. The sound of wounded cattle is painful to recall, and the cows, all bloated up, their legs sticking into the air, are an abiding memory. Our soldiers did not always get buried, and the stench of death was overpowering. I still have an impression of the faces of the dead, pale orange when recently killed, then turning black as corruption overtook them. The Germans had a smell of their own, quite distinctive, a sickly scented, pungent smell, probably from his cooking stoves. I also hated the sound of Spandau fire. It always reminded me of someone tearing canvas. It takes very little time to make a veteran. I remember a night that was typical of Normandy. I arrived back in our area after being in contact with the enemy all day, so tired that I did not dig a hole. I just lay down and fell asleep. When I awoke, I discovered that I had dead Germans buried all around me, but so shallow that their feet and boots stuck out of the ground. The telling thing about this is that I thought nothing of it at the time. I recall the superiority of the German weapons while we were armed with weapons like the Sten gun that fired when you did not want it to, and would not fire when you did. All over Normandy lay the wreckage of burnt-out tanks, the remains of bodies melted into the ground, remains of battle dress, steel helmets, abandoned trenches, rifles, unused shells and mortar rounds, all the detritus of war. Normandy was a murderous place, a murderous place. To defend this murderous place, Rommel needed more divisions, infantry or armoured, and he had to have them on hand before the battle began. Otherwise, German reinforcement divisions must be brought down from north of the Seine, from 15th Army, or up from the south or centre of France, or switched from the defence of Brittany. Apart from the inevitable delay, these units would come under air attack every metre of the way. The swiftest support for 7th Army should have come from the 15th Army, which had 20 infantry divisions and 4 panzer divisions deployed to cover the other likely invasion area, the Pas-de-Calais. On Hitler's orders, this army was kept north of the Seine, largely because he was fooled by Operation Fortitude, the elaborate but highly successful Allied deception plan, which had convinced Hitler and most of the OKW staff that the Normandy landings on June 6th were only a feint, and that the main landing would come later, astride Calais. A glance at the map on page 116 reveals that Rommel's plan, to fight the decisive battle on the beaches, was done for even before the battle began. The widespread deployment of German reserves, a complicated command structure and a reluctance to accept that the Normandy landings were serious, plus Allied air power would cause a critical delay in moving up reserves, and the forces already manning the beach defences were simply not sufficient to prevent the Allies getting ashore. The Battle of Normandy would therefore take place in the hinterland in the weeks after D-Day, and this being so, it is now necessary to consider the ground over which the fighting would take place. The countryside of Normandy is green, rolling and highly agreeable, a mixture of arable and pasture land, dotted with orchards and woods and a quantity of grey stone villages and small towns. This terrain is seamed with gentle rivers and supplied with a number of hills and ridges, rising to heights which, although moderate, still overlook the surrounding countryside and offer extensive views. Some parts, beginning southwest of Caen and stretching towards Saint-Lô, are made up of bocage, small fields surrounded by high banks and hedges, divided by narrow lanes leading to small hamlets and stone-built farmhouses. In peacetime, Normandy is a delightful province. In wartime, the terrain of Normandy is clearly favourable to the defence. One point to note are the rivers. The River Seine marks the northern boundary of the battle area, but there are plenty of other rivers, large and small, of which the Orne, the Soules, the Vire and the Dives will be crucial to this story. And the Orne and the Odon, in their steep-sided valleys, present a particular obstacle to tanks. These rivers rise in the high hinterland, some 50 miles from the Calvados coast, and although they meander east and west, their general flow is south to north. These rivers split the front for an attacker coming south from the Calvados coast, and provide a good defensive line for anyone resisting an attack from the west, especially after the riverbanks have been breached and encouraged to flood the surrounding countryside. Any attack pushing out of Normandy to the east must either go well south and head east, south of the rivers, along the line Avranches-Mortain-Domfront-Alençon, or face a series of waterlogged river valleys with high ridges, woods and hills, virtually impassable to armour. Normandy is by no means flat. The area immediately south of Caen, astride the valley of the Orne, is so rocky and steep-sided that it is known locally as the Suisse normande, Normandy's Switzerland, and the area is dominated by high ground running roughly south and east from Vire towards Alençon, ground overlooked in turn by rising ground and a number of hills, of which hill 112 metre, the Bourguebus Ridge and Montpinçon, 365 metre, would provide particular obstacles to the British and Canadian forces in the weeks after D-Day. Although modern farming methods and the ripping out of hedgerows has changed much of the Norman countryside, and this factor has to be allowed for by modern historians, a critical examination of the ground reveals little to choose in defensive capability between the ground on the Second Army front and that on the First Army front. The Americans had to face marshes and the bocage. The British had to overcome rolling country, with plenty of dead ground and forest, and the steep-sided Odon and Orne valleys, where tanks could make only slow progress and be highly vulnerable in the process. The Second Army front also had its fair share of bocage, and was also narrowed by the Suisse normande, which straddles the country south of Caen, and forced the British and Canadians into a southeasterly path, which the Germans were able to block with a series of defence lines south of Caen. However, the most formidable type of country was the bocage. Linked to the Suisse normande south of Caen and spreading west to the country north of Saint-Lô, this dense network of small fields, woods, narrow sunken lanes, stone farmhouses and small villages inland from the coast creates a terrain virtually impenetrable except to soldiers on foot. The bocage, the hedgerow country, as most American accounts call it, lies behind the beaches and is particularly concentrated in the west of the Calvados department, south of Omaha, and in the direction of Saint-Lô. More bocage is found in other parts of the province villages, named Villa Bocage, and Benny Bocage on the British front indicate that not only the Americans had to fight in the hedgerow country, and this close country was to prove a sore trial to the Allied tank crews and a testing ground for the infantry. Only after the bocage had been penetrated could the invaders reach more open country, where they could flex their muscles, territory where tank forces, artillery and air power could be used with great effect and mobility restored to the battlefield. It is worth noting that none of the Allied units tasked to fight in such terrain were trained in such surroundings. For example, while in England the US 29th and 4th Infantry Divisions were trained on the open, treeless expanses of Salisbury Plain and Dartmoor, whereas the British 7th Armoured Division was trained in Norfolk. Anywhere less like the terrain in which these divisions had to fight in Normandy is hard to imagine. There was more open country near to the Calvados coast, most notably at Carpiquet west of Caen, and on the high plain between Caen and Falaise, ground which the Allied air forces were most anxious to obtain as landing fields. But this ground was well defended, the Bourguebus area with 6 separate but interlocked defensive lines, while the Carpiquet area led south to the Odon and Orne valleys and the Suisse normande. Open country does not extend far anywhere in Normandy, and it was necessary to get beyond Caen and Saint-Lô, 2 crucial and well-defended positions, in order to reach it at all. Beyond these places the Allies could use more of their strength, But until they had taken the bocage and burst through the German defensive lines on the Odon, the Orne and at Bourg-et-Bousse, they were confined in an area where the enemy could punish them with short effective blows, using tanks and infantry in small units of company size, with the deep and narrow lanes providing plenty of overhead cover against aircraft for the tanks and the hedgerows offering perfect positions for snipers, machine gunners, and men equipped with mortars and the deadly German anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust, the tank fist, or the Panzerschreck, the German version of the American rocket launcher or bazooka. Ground itself is not an obstacle, unless it is covered by fire. Here too the Germans had an advantage, as Sidney Jari of the Somerset Light Infantry relates. Basically, the Germans had more firepower than we did and better weapons. Their tanks were better than our tanks with the possible exception of the Sherman Firefly. Their 81mm mortar was better than our 3-inch mortar. Their machine guns, the MG-34 and MG-42, being belt-fed weapons, were better in the defensive role than the 28-round magazine Bren gun, certainly in the attacking role. The result was that we could not hope to suppress their fire with platoon weapons alone, and yet suppressing the enemy fire is the essence of the basic infantry tactic, fire and movement. You use your fire to suppress the enemy fire, and then you can move, which is a good tactic provided you can suppress their fire. But when you are facing an interlinked combination of Dugin automatic weapons, each with a far higher rate of fire than anything you have, how do you suppress it? I have lost count of the times we were forced to ground while a massive amount of German firepower descended on us, tearing up the ground, shredding branches off the trees. A section of 2 MG-42s, the German infantry section weapon, as we had the Bren or the American B.A.R, could deliver 2,400 rounds a minute. That is not an easy thing to go against. We tried various firepower combinations, including carrying 2 Brens per section, but the problems of carting enough 28-round magazines and ammunition about when your sections, which should be 10 men, are already under strength, proved insurmountable. In that close country, the best asset we had, the only one that really made a difference, was our artillery, and there at least we did have the edge. The British gunners in Normandy, the Royal Artillery, were simply superb. Beyond the beaches, the bocage, the Suisse normande and high ground like Montpinçon, the Bourg-et-Bousse Ridge and Hill 112 represented a second line of defence for the German forces. This line would be harder to penetrate than the beach defences, because the invaders' main assets, gunfire support from warships, artillery and tanks, could not be fully brought to bear. The competing forces were too entangled, too close together. Fighting in the bocage and across the Odon and Orne valleys called for troops well versed in close-quarter infantry fighting. In such terrain, the well-trained German soldiers, especially those in the SS units, had a clear advantage. Strong points among these natural defences were formed by the towns and villages. Tilly-sur-Seulles, Montebourg, Carentan, Villers-Bocage, Flers, Mortain, all appear in Allied accounts of the Normandy fighting as places where battles within a battle were fought, places where German and Allied units, infantry and armour, slugged it out hand to hand, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. And then there were positions like Caumont and Évrecy, Montpinçon and Hill 112, which provided good observation points to the German artillery observers, and had to be taken step by painful step as the battle wore on. Jack Capel of the 8th Infantry Regiment, 4th U.S. Infantry Division, also mentions the German defences. On our way up the Cotentin to Montebourg, we were cheered one morning by the arrival of 9 Sherman tanks in support. By nightfall, 6 of them had been knocked out. The situation at that time appeared grim, for we had thought that if the D-Day landings were successful and a good beachhead established, the German defences would collapse. By the time we got up to Cherbourg, we had begun to realise there was a long war ahead, for the Germans were tough fighters, unwilling to give up ground. A landing in Normandy gave the Allies the best launching pad for the eventual conquest of the Reich, but no appreciation of the difficulties facing the troops and their commanders is possible without a full understanding of the difficulties presented by the terrain and the German army. It is this combination of defensive terrain filled with the well-trained and well-equipped soldiers of the German army that caused the Allied commanders grave and unexpected problems in the days and weeks after D-Day. The immediate task of the Allies after D-Day was to link up the beachheads and bring more men and equipment ashore. The task of the German defenders was to drive the invaders into the sea before they could get properly established. Whether the Germans succeeded in this task or not depended very largely on their panzer divisions. At midnight on D-Day, 11:59 p.m. on June 6th to 21st, Panzer was drawn up north of Caen, ready to defend the city after a confused day of fighting, which had seen them halt the forces advancing from Sword at Riva Bella, but lose more than 70 of their 120 tanks in the process. Panzer had advanced to the outskirts of Lyons-sur-Mer that afternoon, before the massive evening glider drop to reinforce 6th Airborne obliged it to draw back towards Caen and go over to the defensive. Even so, 21st Panzer and the resistance put up by other German troops had prevented Second Army reaching Caen. As we shall see, the effects of that action would be far-reaching. Colonel Helmut Rittgen of Panzer Lehr explains what happened at this time to some of the German forces outside Caen. After the landings on the night of 5th to 6th June, 21st Panzer had been thrown piecemeal into the battle to counter the British airborne landings north of Caen. This move was halted when more British airborne in gliders landed in our rear, and by the evening of D-Day the British had captured a coastal strip 6 miles long but not very deep. In vain the exhausted German defenders looked for reinforcements, but all the local reserves had been used up. However, C&C West von Rundstedt had ordered increased readiness for Panzer Group West von Schweppenberg, which included Panzer Lehr, 12th SS Panzer, and 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, now released from OKW control. Then the 12th SS Panzer was put under command of Army Group B, and Colonel Kurt Meyer led them towards a sector east of the Orne. Movement was difficult because of enemy air activity during the day and failures of our radio sets. However, marching at night turned out to be reasonably safe, and Panzer Lehr, my unit, made good progress towards the Flers-Vier area, using routes we had previously reconnoitred. We finally went into the line on June 9th. Some idea of the quality of the German forces defending Normandy is set out in this brief account. 12 SS Panzer was a superbly trained and equipped unit, manned by enthusiastic former members of the Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend, and led by some of the most battle-hardened and experienced officers in the Waffen-SS, people like Colonel Kurt Meyer. These SS units had the pick of the tanks, equipment and training facilities, and were noticeably larger than non-SS Panzer units, as already noted. 12th SS Panzer had over 20,000 men. Panzer Lehr, commanded by General Fritz von Bayerlein, was another fine tank unit. The word Lehr means training, but Panzer Lehr was no training formation. This division had been the demonstration unit for the Wehrmacht's tank forces, and had new Tiger tanks armed with the 88mm gun, plenty of Panthers and Mark IVs, and the pick of the non-SS officers and men. Both divisions were to give a good account of themselves in the Normandy fighting. As already related, the arrival of airborne reinforcements on the afternoon of D-Day obliged 21st Panzer to call off their bid for the beaches. Had it succeeded, this move would have split the British on Sword from the Canadian forces coming ashore on Juno. On June 7th, 21 Panzer concentrated on holding the British away from Caen and putting in small localised counterattacks against the 6th Airborne perimeter, which was still consolidating on the Ranville Ridge. This enabled 12 SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr to form up alongside 21 Panzer when they arrived in the area during June 7th and on the night of June 7th to 8th.